Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Weld. I'm an ASHRAE member and a member of the Historical Society, and we are meeting today in Atlanta, and it's February the 18th, and we are at the semi-annual meeting, and it's my pleasure to be able to interview today Mr. Paul Auchenbach, who's a long-time, well-known member of the Society. Paul is a fellow of ASHRAE. He earned his Distinguished Service Award some years ago, and he served on the board for a number of occasions, and he served as 1 year as Vice President. Paul, it's very nice for you to be with us today, and thank you for coming. Perhaps we might start by having you give us a little review of your life and where you were born and your early education and that sort of thing. Could we start that way?
Okay.
Great.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I feel honored to be interviewed. I was born, I and my two sisters were born in Canada, about 50 miles north of the Montana-Canadian line. And both of our parents were born in the U.S., however. My father went west with his parents when he was 12 years old to Wyoming in 1886. In 1898, when he was a little past 20, he and a friend went to Canada to take up some land because Canada had some very favorable arrangements for owning land. So he went up there and built a log cabin and farmed a quarter or so of land for about 10 years, and then came back to Wyoming and married my mother and took her up there. They stayed up there for 12 years until 1920. They established a country store and a post office, but it wasn't a very good place for education for children. We were 35 miles from the nearest railroad, and sometimes we got a teacher for 3 months out of the year and sometimes 6 months out of the year. So she insisted that we move back to Wyoming. When we moved back to Wyoming, we lived in the country for 3 years. Both my sister and I got put in the 6th grade, even though I was only 9 years old at the time. And we finished our grade school education in the country and then moved to Sheridan, Wyoming, which is near the northern part of the state, to go to high school. I graduated from high school in 1927, or we both did, and the two of us each got a grant, a fellowship grant to the university when we were seniors. So my parents moved to Laramie, that's the city where the university is, to go to college. I graduated in electrical engineering in 1931, but you couldn't get a job at all because that was the height of the Depression. So I went back for another year and got a mechanical engineering degree in 1932. There still wasn't any jobs to be had. I stayed at home during the year of 1932-33 because my father was seriously ill. And during that year, I hauled coal from the mine to town in order to earn some money. And it was during that winter that Roosevelt had the bank holiday for a couple of weeks, and cash was really hard to come by. Well, anyway, in the fall then of '32, I was offered a job at the Laramie power plant in Laramie, Wyoming. And so I stayed there, went through most of the jobs they had, and had a thorough training in the engineering of power generation. In '35 then, I was offered a job at Fort Peck, Montana. In 1933, they decided to build a dam across the Missouri River at Fort Peck. And by 1935, they had several dredges there and needed to expand their force. So I and several of my classmates were offered jobs as strikers on these dredges. So we spent a couple of years up there, and during that time I took the junior engineer exam with civil service. And I got a good grade, and there weren't very many competitors from Montana. So in the fall of '37, I got an offer to come to the National Bureau of Standards in Washington. And so that was the beginning of my career here. The reason this job opened up in the mid-30s, Roosevelt had decided that he wanted to use the building industry as a means to stimulate the whole economy. The Depression hadn't really ended then, yet. And as you've probably read, there were as many as 25% of the people unemployed during that period. Anyway, in 1937, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, gave a grant to the National Bureau of Standards for $50,000 for 3 years to study low-cost housing and heating equipment for low-cost housing. So the Bureau of Standards hired 6 engineers at that time, and I was one of those, to carry out this program. So that's how I got into the HVAC industry. And that career lasted for 42 years. And the only thing I want to say about my career after that is I did a little consulting. I served ASHRAE as an interim director of research for 9 months and was leading the exploration for a new director. So that's a brief summary of my career.
So you were born in a log cabin.
Yeah.
You have degrees in mechanical and electrical engineering, and you're an old coal miner as well.
Yes.
Do you hold? You were born in Canada. Do you hold dual citizenship or just United States?
Just United States. When my family came back to the U.S. After a few years, and I don't just remember how many, they applied for citizenship again, and I was not yet 18, so I got what they call derivative citizenship from the citizenship of my parents.
I see. Okay. So when you decided to take was mechanical engineering first?
Yes. No, electrical.
Electrical. I'm sorry. What led you to the field of engineering as opposed to some other field?
Well, that was mostly my parents doing, I think. I was only 15 when I graduated from high school, and I wasn't very adept yet at career investigation. And I think they steered me there for 2 reasons. One, I was a good student, and I didn't have any trouble with mathematics. So I enrolled in engineering.
Perhaps you could remember some things about the industry when you first started, the HVAC industry, when you first started with standards?
Coal was still a primary heating fuel for housing, but they were beginning to convert heating systems to oil and gas. There was also problems with burning fuel oil without soot, smokeless. So there was interest in how much draft they needed to burn free of soot, and how chimneys would perform to make the heating equipment work well. So we started out, well, I actually started by testing jacketed fireplaces. That was probably the cheapest and simplest heating equipment you could get, but it wasn't very good. You roasted in front of the fireplace and froze in all the other rooms. But anyway, we studied small heating systems. And as I say, FHA gave this grant to the Bureau to study small buildings and heating equipment. And so they were interested in our examining how various small equipment worked. In 1940, we built what we called the test bungalow, but it was really one of the FHA buildings that they built for occupants. It was a 4-room house with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and living room, about 625 square feet of floor area. So we put a lot of different heating equipment in that house and studied the equipment and how well it heated the house. We actually put one of the fireplaces in there too. but we studied all kinds of things in that house. Other things that were important at that time were they began to build houses on concrete slabs directly placed on the ground. And that raised questions of moisture rise through the concrete, as well as the edge of the floor getting too cold and condensing moisture on the floor. So we studied concrete floor slabs. I think it was a little later that we began to study underground heat distribution systems, the insulated piping systems for underground systems that were used extensively at Air Force bases. So those are some of the things that were going on at that time.
Okay. Perhaps we could talk a little about ASHRAE. When you joined, it wasn't ASHRAE at that time, I presume, but when did you join?
I joined in 1942. My boss, R.S. Dill, was a member of ASHRAE and quite active in the society, and he urged some of us to join. Not all of the 6 engineers that I was a part of joined. But anyway, I was active in the chapter and in the region. I was president of the Washington chapter in 1949, I believe. I was also a member of the Baltimore, Washington chapter of the American Society of Refrigerating Engineers. They were a joint chapter at that time. I was president of that chapter in 1957. It was shortly after that that the two societies merged.
You obviously served on many ASHRAE committees of all sorts, including TCs. Would you like to cover some of that?
There's fuels, combustion, sorption, weather data, survival shelters, heating load, air cleaning devices, urban environment, water coolers. I was also associate editor of the ASHRAE guide and the ASRE guide and data book at different times. I was chairman of the R&T committee at one time, and also the International Relations Committee. I served 2 3-year terms at different times on the board of directors, and I was elected as treasurer and vice president of the society in the middle 70s. Those were the principal associations with ASHRAE committees. I was also involved in quite a few other organizations. We talk about the F. Paul Anderson Award for a moment. I didn't mention that in the introduction, but you were awarded that prestigious award in 1976. 1976.
It's considered to be the most prestigious award that ASHRAE can give on a regular basis, which is quite something. It's awarded for notable achievement in outstanding work of any area of the society. Perhaps we could cover the area in which your outstanding work took place.
Well, the award itself acknowledges scientific work, outstanding scientific work, and then identifies 5 categories or 5 items. It doesn't go into the subject matter, but those items were extensive publication of technical articles. I was awarded the ASHRAE, I was awarded the gold medal from the National Bureau of Standards for work on standards, and I was awarded the Edward B. Rosa Award for the work I did on the energy conservation in buildings. I was also awarded, or made a fellow and awarded the Distinguished Service Award by ASHRAE, as well as the Paul Anderson Award. I was a fellow of American Association for Advancement of Science. I was a member of Sigma Xi, and also an honorary vice president of the International Institute of Refrigeration.
1976 was the year that you received the award. Can you remember what was happening in the world at that time?
Well, as you probably remember, it was about 1971 when the gasoline shortage became acute, and we became aware that there was a fuel shortage. And so in the years immediately following that, the Bureau of Standards got involved in energy conservation. In fact, I was given credit for starting the energy conservation activities at the Bureau. The way this really got started, the Bureau of Standards had been the reason for creating what is called NICSVIX, the National Building Conference on Building Codes and Standards. They had been in existence for a few years, and in the summer of 1973 they met in Salt Lake City, and they asked me to come out and discuss some of the work we were doing on energy conservation. And there were 2 or 3 others from the Bureau came. And somehow in my discussion, I made a statement that I thought there was enough technical information to produce a set of design guidelines for energy conservation in new buildings. Well, we came home, and a few weeks later, the officials from NICSVIX came to the Bureau and said, "We'd like to have you do that." So the officials thought it was a good idea, and we put together a task group of about 6 or 8 people from the Bureau. And we had a person from ASHRAE, Walter Spielbuckle, and I think it was Ralph Johnston of the National Association of Home Builders. And so we sat down and put together a document which I think was called Design Guidelines for Energy Conservation in New Buildings. It took us about 6 months to do that. And in 1974, somewhere around the middle of that year, at the summer meeting of ASHRAE in Los Angeles, the substance of that document was presented at the ASHRAE meeting. And a few of the members, their reaction to that presentation was, well, this is another effort to the federal government to tell the industry what it has to do. Well, in a matter of weeks after that, we had, well, I should say first, the Bureau of Standards itself decided it did not want to issue that as a standard. So we asked ASHRAE to take that document as a starting point and go from there. We thought they were the best of 2 or 3 agencies that might have taken it, and they agreed to take it. So starting somewhere in the middle of 1934, ASHRAE inherited this document, and I think they appointed about 100 different people to work on different parts of it. And they came out with their first document in 1975. And of course, since that time, it's been changing and adding on to, and in fact, there was a whole series of guidelines for existing buildings that came out of that too. And I should also add that the Illuminating Engineering Society joined with ASHRAE in sponsoring this document.
One of the questions I had in mind to ask you was what problems and major issues were facing ASHRAE at the time of your award. I think you pretty well covered them all, unless there's some that you've missed.
Well, energy conservation was important. I believe at that time there was also beginning to be a problem with water quality in some of the lakes and rivers because of dumping toxic materials. There was just beginning to be concern with air quality. And of course the energy conservation brought on a much wider use of insulation in buildings. So as well as a drive to improve the efficiency of equipment. So there was a big activity in evaluating different insulations, and there were a lot of new materials proposed. Some of them were pretty well suited and some of them not. And also was a big push to improve the performance of air conditioners and heating plants. So all of that sort of went on together and was as a result of the need to conserve energy.
Maybe we could talk about people. You were dealing with a lot of important and people who are changing the whole ideas of things at that stage. Let's talk about people for a moment.
Two people that were very much in the front lines of research at the time I joined the society were Professors Fahnestock and Kratz at the University of Illinois. They had already done and continued to do a large amount of research on warm air heating in a two-story frame house that they had on the campus. And they published a lot of material on that. Then when the society decided not to operate a laboratory themselves anymore, Kansas State University took the environmental chamber that ASHRAE had, and Ralph Nevins operated that for a number of years and produced a lot of new information on human comfort. Pharaoh Gaggy was also prominent at that time. He specialized in the effect of radiation sources on comfort. Two people that I was associated with and were important in my opinion were Richard Jordan from the University of Minnesota and Bill Penser from the Department of Agriculture. They were instrumental in increasing our connection with the international group. They promoted and led the effort for ASHRAE to take part with the International Institute of Refrigeration and the International Standards Organization. Another person that was quite prominent was Ron Tye. He was the granddaddy of informational insulation. He wrote a book or two on the properties of insulation and their physical and thermal properties. Then that was the beginning, or sort of the beginning of the time when computers were beginning to be used for calculating heating loads and energy requirements. One of my fellow workers, Tom Kasuda, and a couple of men by the name of Kumali and Lochmanican, they were sort of competing with each other as to who was going to have the most to say about computerization. And so they were sort of in the vanguard of introducing that into ASHRAE technology. I took occasion in preparing for this conference or this interview to look at the 4 current ASHRAE volumes. And I looked at various chapters, and I looked at the bibliographies of some of the chapters that I was familiar with. And I found in that examination that the technology has advanced measurably since the time of these folks, and that in the bibliographies they're only marginally mentioned. So I think it indicated to me that the society is growing, moving, and advancing, and that even though their technology was highly regarded at that time, it's been superseded essentially by newer work.
Interesting, very interesting. The technical changes which you're referring to, which have come along through the years, has made ASHRAE, shall we say, an ever-changing society going in the various directions required at the time. What events or what things were going on in '76 that can you recall that caused ASHRAE to make any changes that they may have made at that time?
Well, of course, the energy conservation was the leading issue at the time, and there were quite a few side issues to that, improving the efficiency of heating and cooling equipment, insulating buildings so that they required less energy, being able to evaluate how much energy was needed, and that's where the computers came in, the computerization of energy use and load calculations became very pressing. There was also quite a bit of concern about water quality, and air quality began to be important at that time. So these issues were foremost. Then, of course, the use of wide amounts or large amounts of insulation in buildings said they needed less heat. So quite a few of the companies had to build smaller units. And in fact, it was a little difficult, some of them found, to build a unit that was small enough for, say, a 4-room house. And so there was a lot of new equipment built for the purpose, smaller in capacity than had been in the past.
The HVAC industry in the past, whatever, 30 years has grown by leaps and bounds. ASHRAE has grown as well. You feel that ASHRAE has kept up with the industry and has contributed to the requirements of the industry?
Yes, I feel like they have. I think they've done a number of things for the industry. It's my opinion that ASHRAE has provided a technical base for the industry's work. In other words, it's research supported. The technology is research supported. I think ASHRAE has also increased the vitality and the flexibility and the responsibility of the society in general. And through its active standards program, I think it's made it more responsive and more responsible to the consumers. I view standards as the meeting ground for the producers and the consumers. They both have an opportunity to express their needs, and the consensus process really modifies those two things. So I think ASHRAE has been good for the society.
Young people coming along in the industry, a couple of questions. Would you recommend a young person interested in that field to get into that field? And presumably you would say yes to that. And if you did, what further advice would you give them?
Well, I'd say they should join as soon as they could afford it.
Good answer.
And that they should participate in all the areas of interest that they have an interest in, and that they should go for the top in the area of their special interest.
You've been around the society for a long time. You must have seen some humorous things happen and some humorous things that have happened. You might wish to recall some of those.
I'll mention a couple of things that are sort of humorous or sort of half ironic, I guess. Back quite a few years when weather data was important and being studied, there was a move to put more than one design temperature in the guide for designing heating and cooling equipment. And I was on the weather data committee at that time. Anyway, when that proposal came forward, one of the fairly well-known members of the society opposed putting more than one temperature in there, and he said that would restrict the area of judgment that engineers were supposed to exert. But that didn't prevail. His idea didn't prevail. So we have more than one design temperature in the guide. The other thing I wanted to mention was when we produced that document. Well, I guess I've already covered the turning over that document to ASHRAE for development as a design guideline for energy conservation. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention. In about 1975, I made a serious proposal to ASHRAE that they add another phrase to their purpose, statement of purpose, and that was the thermal performance of buildings. And it went before the board, but it was rejected. I thought it was logical because ASHRAE, even at that time and for many years, had been the principal source of information on the thermal properties of insulation and of material systems and of design data, and it seemed logical, and thermal comfort. So it seemed logical that this was a logical extension. Well, it was rejected. And I personally rationalized that perhaps there were too many machinery people on the board at that time. But, you know, even though the inclusion in their statement of purpose was rejected, they've gone ahead now and they're really in the forefront of of energy use and comfort in buildings.
You're retired now.
Yes.
You have a very active mind, and you've been a busy man all your life. You don't sit and do nothing, I'm sure. How do you fill your day?
Well, after I retired from the Bureau, I consulted with DOE for a number of years. I should also mention, maybe I have already, I don't think I have, that I served as an interim director of research for the Society for 9 months. The existing director retired about the same time I did, and I led the search for a new director of research. Then I got interested in the control of moisture in buildings. One of the results of adding a lot of insulation to buildings was there was more tendency for condensation to occur in the insulated space. And there wasn't a very good appreciation on the part of many builders as to what the hazards were. So I got interested in that area, and we, along with another member of the society, we did a few field studies and published a paper or two on moisture control in buildings. And I was one of the co-authors of an ASTM manual that was produced 3 or 4 years ago on that subject. Another well, I won't say it's non-professional, but non-ASHRAE subject. I was instrumental in inducing a church congregation to move, and that's not easy, to a new site. Our building was too old and overcrowded, but in the first effort at a vote to move, well, I should say that our Constitution required that we have 75% approval if we're going to move. We got 73%. So then we had another go-round, and we got a little sweeter offer from our developer. It gave us a chance to go back to the congregation. And before we took that vote, we did a little arm twisting. So we got about 80% the next time. So we had the approval to move, and then I was also on the committee to design a new building. So that took quite a little time. In fact, it took several years to accomplish that. So aside from those things, I've been helping to raise grandchildren.
Oh, good for you. Sometimes the non-technical tasks are more difficult than the technical ones that we're used to dealing with through our lives. ASHRAE is a growing society, as demonstrated by its growing membership and the increase in attendance at the meetings. It's in financial good condition. Where do you see it going, and what pitfalls or problems do you foresee, if any?
Well, it's hard to predict the future. I don't really want to do much in the way of prediction. However, I'll make one comment at least. Last fall, there was a symposium held in Washington on super insulation. And I guess we had a dozen papers presented by various companies and organizations who were experimenting with much higher levels of insulation in buildings. And in many cases, that consisted of evacuating the space that the insulation was in. And that improves the resistance substantially, 2 or 3 times, or even more sometimes. There wasn't much said about the application of these ideas. There was only, I think, one company that is producing a small panel that could be installed in a wall. It occurred to me, though, that if this develops and gets very widely used, it's going to reduce the heat loss of houses so that the heating season for a building will be much shorter and the cooling season will be longer. And there may be some climatic areas where you won't need any heating at all. And this will pose a problem for small systems again. It probably will promote electric heating, which has already grown quite substantially. Now, whether super insulation will take hold or not remains to be seen. There's a lot of work being done on it.
We've had a pleasant talk. I've asked you a number of questions. I'm sure there's some questions that you may wish that I did ask and didn't. What would you like to cover that I haven't asked you to cover?
I've been retired from the NBS for 16 years and fully retired from pretty much useful occupation for 3 or 4 years. But I wanted to say that maybe I haven't lost quite all of my indirect influence on the Bureau, on the heating and ventilating industry, because in 1983, Clint Phillips was the president. He worked for me for about 35 years in my organization. Then the next president coming up, Jim Hill, was on my staff at the Bureau for a number of years. Jim Hildenbrand, who's a manager of standards, was on my staff when I retired, and it was he and I that were leading the group in putting together this design criteria for energy conservation. So he's fully involved with the continuing development of those standards. And then Dr. Didion, who I believe is going to be given the E.K. Camel Award at this meeting, he was a section chief under my leadership for several years, so I wouldn't want to claim that I've brainwashed them or that they would agree with me on everything, but maybe I still have a lot of influence.
I'm sure you do. Well, I've enjoyed this very much, Paul, and I want to thank you very much for coming to us today. We've just been interviewing Mr. Paul Auchenbach, who's a long-term member of ASHRAE, a fellow of ASHRAE, served on the board for many years, including treasurer and vice president, also the recipient of the F. Paul Anderson Award. And it's been a real pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure and an honor to do this.
Thank you.